He had everything: wealth, power, an empire built on ruthless ambition. But at his own wedding, Ethan Cross came face to face with the one thing he never saw coming: his 3 children, the ones he never knew existed. The moment shattered his perfect world, forcing him to confront the painful truth. Success had cost him the only thing that truly mattered. Can he win back the family he lost? Or is it too late? Where are you watching from? Don't forget to subscribe for more incredible stories. Ethan Cross sat in his glass-walled office, a towering fortress of steel and innovation that loomed over the city like a monument to his empire. The world outside moved in a calculated rhythm, cars weaving through the streets below, people rushing between meetings, skyscrapers reflecting the golden hues of a setting sun. From up here, everything was beneath him, controlled, predictable. He leaned back in his leather chair, fingers steepled beneath his chin, his mind already shifting to the next move. His life was a meticulously crafted game of strategy, each decision calculated, each sacrifice measured. It was how he had built Crosstech from the ground up, turning it into a billion-dollar empire that dictated the course of the tech industry. He had won. He had everything: power, influence, a name that commanded respect in every boardroom from Wall Street to Silicon Valley. And soon he would solidify it all with the most anticipated wedding of the year. Sophia Monroe was more than just a fiancée. She was a statement, a symbol of perfection. Her name carried weight in the social elite, her face gracing magazine covers and exclusive events. Together, they would be unstoppable. Their wedding was already being hailed as the event of the decade, an extravagant affair set on a private island where the guest list read like a Forbes billionaire index. Ethan smirked as he glanced at the itinerary on his sleek tablet. Everything was in place, every detail was flawless, his empire was untouchable. Yet, as he skimmed through the final list of guests, a name slipped into his mind like an uninvited thought. Lena Walker. The name was a ghost from another life, a life before Crosstech had swallowed him whole, before ambition had hardened him into the man he was now. She had loved him once, back when he was just a man with a dream, not an empire. She had stood beside him in the early days when success was still uncertain, when late nights were spent in a cramped apartment rather than a penthouse overlooking the skyline. She had seen the version of him that wasn't polished, the one that still laughed, still cared. But in the end, she had wanted more than what he was willing to give, more than stolen moments between meetings, more than empty promises of soon. She had wanted a partner, not a king, and when she realized she would never get that, she had walked away. Ethan hadn't stopped her. There had been no drawn-out goodbyes, no dramatic scenes. She had simply packed her bags, left behind a few quiet words about his inability to love anything beyond his ambition, and disappeared. At the time, he hadn't given her a second thought. He had been too busy building an empire, too focused on the bigger picture. Love was a distraction. Attachments were liabilities. He had moved on, leaving the past exactly where it belonged, behind him. But now, years later, as he sat at the pinnacle of success, staring at the glowing screen of his wedding plans, a thought crept in. What would she think if she saw him now? If she saw what he had become? Would she regret walking away? The idea settled in his mind, curling at the edges like smoke. A slow smirk tugged at his lips. He reached for his phone, pressing a single button. "Andrea?" he said smoothly when his assistant answered. "Yes, Mr. Cross?" Her voice was crisp, efficient. Send an invitation to Lena Walker. Make sure it's hand-delivered." There was the briefest pause, a hesitation so slight it was almost imperceptible. Andrea never questioned him. Yet, for just a fraction of a second, it was as if even she recognized the weight of that name. "Lena Walker," she repeated. "Are you sure?" Ethan's smirk deepened. "Oh, I'm sure." She wouldn't ignore it. Curiosity would get the best of her. She would open that envelope, read his name printed in gold lettering, and she would remember. She would remember what she had walked away from. And when she stepped into his wedding, when she saw the extravagance, the perfection, the power, she would know. She had lost. The invitation arrived on a Tuesday, slipping through the mail slot of a sunlit art studio, where the scent of fresh paint and turpentine filled the air. Lena Walker didn't notice it at first. She was too focused, caught in the rhythm of brush strokes across canvas, the familiar sanctuary of color and texture. Painting had always been her escape, her way of making sense of emotions she didn't have time to process. It wasn't until her youngest, Emma, came bounding into the room, curly hair bouncing as she held up the thick envelope in her small hands, that Lena even registered it. "Mommy, you got a fancy letter." Lena wiped her hands on her apron, smiling as she took it. "Did I now?" The envelope was expensive, heavy cardstock, embossed lettering, the kind of thing that didn't belong in a life like hers anymore. A strange feeling curled in her chest as she turned it over and saw the name printed in precise script. Ethan Cross. The air seemed to still. For a long moment, she just stared at it. Then, slowly, she slid her finger beneath the seal and pulled out the invitation. "Mr. Ethan Cross and Miss Sophia Monroe cordially invite you to celebrate their union." Lena read it twice, then a third time. Her stomach twisted in a way she hadn't felt in years. Why? Why now? She had made peace with the past. Or, at least, she had thought she had. But this was a crack in that carefully built wall. Ethan wanted her to see this. It wasn't an olive branch. It wasn't a mistake. It was deliberate. A calculated move from a man who never did anything without an agenda. Lena exhaled sharply, her fingers tightening around the invitation. She should throw it away, rip it in half, forget it existed. But then a small voice broke through her thoughts. "Mom?" She looked down. Lucas and Noah stood in the doorway, their identical gazes filled with quiet curiosity. "Who's it from?" Lucas asked. Lena hesitated. Their father had always been a shadow in their lives, a name they had never spoken, a figure they had never known. She had never lied to them, but she had never told them the full truth either. And lately they had started to notice, to ask questions. Now the answer was staring her in the face, printed in perfect calligraphy. Maybe it was time. Her fingers curled around the invitation. "I think," she said slowly, "we're going to a wedding." Lena hadn't set foot in Ethan's world in nearly a decade, and yet, as she stood before the towering gates of the Cross estate, she felt the past pressing against her like a living thing. The air was thick with the hum of anticipation, the estate sprawling before her in a display of sheer extravagance, marble columns, glittering chandeliers visible through the grand windows, and a garden so meticulously curated that it looked like something out of a dream. No, not a dream. A fantasy. One Ethan had crafted for himself. One that had no place for her. She tightened her grip on Emma's hand, feeling the steady weight of her daughter's small fingers wrapped around hers. Lucas and Noah stood at her sides, their gazes sweeping over the scene with varying degrees of curiosity and skepticism. "This place is ridiculous," Lucas muttered, stuffing his hands into his pockets. His sharp brown eyes. Ethan's eyes narrowed as he took in the line of sleek black cars pulling up to the valet, the clusters of perfectly dressed guests stepping onto the red carpet that led into the estate. "Are we sure this isn't a movie set?" Lena exhaled, steadying herself. "It's just a house, Lucas." Noah, the quieter of the two boys, adjusted the cuffs of his small suit and glanced at her. "It's more like a castle," he murmured. "And we don't belong here." That much was true. They were a stark contrast to the scene before them. Lena in her simple but elegant emerald dress, her children in crisp but modest suits that lacked the designer labels and tailored perfection of the guests swarming past them. They weren't supposed to be here. That was the message being silently conveyed in the careful, curious glances thrown their way. But they were here, and there was no turning back now. A uniformed attendant stepped forward, hesitating only briefly as his gaze flicked over the children before forcing a polite smile. "Name, ma'am?" Lena lifted her chin. "Lena Walker." The man's brows twitched. There was a moment, just a fraction of hesitation, before he nodded and gestured for them to follow. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of expensive perfume and freshly cut white roses, the grand hall filled with murmuring guests draped in jewels and silk. A live orchestra played something soft and elegant in the background, the music weaving seamlessly into the polished hum of conversation. And then, as if the room itself had sensed their presence, the noise faltered. Not entirely, not all at once, but enough. A ripple of awareness passed through the crowd, heads turning subtly, whispers stirring behind delicate hands. Lena felt it like a physical weight, the scrutiny, the curiosity, the realization blooming in the eyes of those who recognized her. And then, across the hall, Ethan turned. For a brief, frozen moment, she saw something flicker in his expression. Not surprise, not really. He had expected her to come. But there was something else. A brief hitch in his breath, a shift in his posture so minute that no one else might have noticed. Except, she noticed, because once, a long time ago, she had known every one of Ethan Cross's tells. He was standing near the grand staircase, his tuxedo impeccably tailored, his presence effortlessly commanding. By his side, Sophia Monroe, stunning in a couture gown that likely cost more than Lena's entire house, stiffened. Sophia wasn't foolish. She had spent enough time in high society to recognize a threat when she saw one, and that's exactly what Lena was. Not because she wanted to be, but because the three children standing beside her looked exactly like the man about to marry someone else. The murmur of the crowd deepened, the realization spreading like wildfire. Lena felt her heartbeat in her throat, but she refused to waver. She had not come here for a scene. She had not come here for revenge or to dredge up the past. She had come because her sons deserved the truth. Ethan stepped forward, cutting through the thick air like a blade. The crowd parted for him instinctively, the weight of his presence undeniable. When he stopped in front of them, the silence became deafening. His gaze swept over the boys, pausing on each of them, his breath coming slower now, more measured. Lucas stared back, unflinching, his jaw set in the same stubborn tilt that had always belonged to Ethan. Noah, more reserved, studied him with an unreadable expression, his sharp eyes taking in every micro-movement. every unspoken thought. And then Emma, sweet Emma, blinked up at him, her small fingers still curled in Lena's. Ethan inhaled sharply, and Lena saw the exact moment the truth hit him. Saw the understanding slam into him like a freight train, shattering whatever carefully constructed narrative he had told himself. Lena kept her voice even, steady. "I didn't come here for you, Ethan." His eyes flicked back to hers, dark, stormy, unreadable. She glanced at the boys before looking back at him. "I came because they deserve to know who their father is." The silence stretched. Sophia's fingers curled into the fabric of her dress, her perfectly poised expression beginning to crack at the edges. She wasn't speaking, not yet, but Lena could feel the barely restrained fury radiating from her. Ethan's throat worked as if he wanted to say something, but nothing came. And then Lucas, bold, defiant, fearless, stepped forward, breaking the fragile stillness. "You don't remember us," he said, not as a question, but a statement. Ethan finally exhaled, as if he had been holding his breath for far too long. His voice caught, and Lena felt a flicker of something she hadn't expected. Regret. Real, visceral regret. Because Ethan Cross wasn't a man who lost control. But right now, in this moment, he was completely, utterly lost. The tension in the grand hall became unbearable. The murmurs grew louder, speculation spreading like wildfire. Sophia's expression hardened, her lips pressing into a tight, furious line. "Ethan," she said, her voice low but edged with venom, "who are these children?" He didn't answer, because he didn't need to. The resemblance was unmistakable. And in that moment, as the weight of the past came crashing down on him, Ethan Cross realized one simple, irrefutable truth. He had just lost control of the life he had so carefully built. Ethan Cross had never felt time slow before. His entire life had been a carefully calculated series of movements, decisions made in seconds, risks weighed and executed with the precision of a master strategist. But now, as he stood in the center of what was supposed to be his perfect wedding, the air heavy with the stunned silence of high society, he found himself completely, utterly frozen. The three children in front of him, his children, were staring at him with expressions that varied from sharp defiance to quiet curiosity. Lucas, the bold one, stood with his arms crossed, mirroring Ethan's own posture when he was ready for a fight. Noah, more reserved, was watching him with those dark, calculating eyes that felt far too familiar. And then there was Emma, small and delicate, her tiny fingers still curled around Lena's hand, blinking up at him with wide-eyed innocence. A dull roaring filled Ethan's ears, drowning out the whispers spreading through the crowd like wildfire. He had spent years mastering the art of control, of never being caught off guard. And yet here he was, standing in the middle of his own wedding, blindsided. Sophia's grip on his arm tightened, nails digging through the fabric of his tuxedo. "Ethan," she hissed, her voice a sharp whisper meant for him alone. "Say something." But what was there to say? What words existed for a moment like this? The reporters, who had been invited to capture the glamour of the event, now had a far juicier story. Camera flashes flickered subtly from the corners of the hall, capturing the moment that would be splashed across headlines by morning. Millionaire CEOs. Wedding interrupted by secret children. Ethan crossed, a father in hiding. Ethan swallowed, his throat dry. He forced himself to meet Lena's gaze. She looked different from how he remembered. Not older. No, stronger. More sure of herself, unshaken, even as the world around them threatened to spiral into chaos. Lena didn't speak. She didn't need to. Her message had been clear enough the moment she walked through those doors. I didn't come for you, Ethan. I came because they deserve to know. Sophia, still waiting for an answer, finally let go of his arm, stepping slightly away from him. A calculated move. Not enough to cause a scene, but enough for the guests to see the distance growing between them. Her expression remained carefully composed, but he could feel the fury radiating off her. She wasn't just angry, she was humiliated. And Sophia Monroe did not tolerate humiliation. Lena broke the silence first. I'd say congratulations are in order, she said, her voice smooth but edged with something sharp. It's not every day a man gets to celebrate his wedding and meet his children for the first time. A ripple of amusement spread through the crowd, mixing with the whispers, the barely concealed gasps. Ethan's jaw clenched. He had expected her to come looking defeated, jealous. Instead, she was standing tall, composed, unshaken by the wealth and power surrounding her. She didn't look like a woman who had lost. She looked like a woman who had won. Lucas stepped forward before Ethan could respond, his voice cutting through the tension. You didn't even know we existed, did you? Ethan's hands curled into fists at his sides. He could feel the weight of the eyes on him. His investors, his competitors, his so-called friends, all waiting to see how he would handle this. But for the first time in his life, he had no strategy, no carefully planned response. Because Lucas was right. He hadn't known. And somehow, that made it worse. Lena tilted her head slightly, her expression unreadable. I didn't hide them from you, Ethan. She paused, letting that sink in. You just never cared enough to look. Another cutting blow, another truth he couldn't deny. The air grew heavier, the walls of the grand hall suddenly feeling too small, too suffocating. Then Sophia, her patience officially gone, stepped between them, her perfectly rehearsed smile just slightly too tight. This is not the time for whatever this is. She turned to Lena, her tone dismissive. If you wanted a moment with Ethan, you could have scheduled an appointment like everyone else. Lena's lips curved into something that wasn't quite a smile. Oh, I didn't come here for Ethan. I came for them. She looked down at Lucas, Noah, and Emma. They deserved to know the man who left them behind. Sophia inhaled sharply, her composure finally cracking. Ethan didn't. I think, Lena cut her off, her voice unwavering. Ethan can answer for himself. Sophia turned to him, furious. Ethan? And for the first time in years, Ethan Cross had no words. The silence stretched too long. The damage had already been done. Then, suddenly, Dante Reyes stepped forward from the crowd. Ethan's former friend, now rival, was dressed in a perfectly tailored suit, the kind of effortless elegance that only came with old money. He smirked, swirling the whiskey in his glass as he studied the unfolding disaster with amusement. Well, Dante said smoothly, his voice cutting through the room like a scalpel. I'd say congratulations are in order. After all, it's not every day a man finds out he's the proud father of 3. Ethan turned slowly, his patience hanging by a thread. Not now, Dante. Dante's smirk deepened. He was enjoying this. Oh, come on. This is a big moment for you, he continued, his tone dripping with faux sincerity. What's the plan, Cross? Denial? Damage control? Maybe a last-minute PR spin? I mean, let's be honest. This isn't exactly your brand." A low hum of laughter spread through the more cynical guests. Ethan exhaled sharply, forcing himself to stay composed. Dante was waiting for him to break, waiting for him to snap. But Lucas beat him to it. The boy turned to Dante with a glare that could have cut glass. "Who the hell are you?" Dante blinked, clearly not expecting the child to challenge him. A few guests gasped at the language, but Ethan, despite everything, felt a flicker of something unexpected. Pride. Lucas wasn't afraid. He wasn't intimidated by the wealth, the power, the spectacle. He was standing his ground, just like Ethan would have. Dante recovered quickly, amusement flickering in his gaze. "Just an old friend of your father's," he said, taking a lazy sip of his drink. "Though I imagine he never mentioned me." Lucas didn't flinch. That's funny, because until about 5 minutes ago he never mentioned us either." Another ripple of murmurs, another sharp, cutting truth. Ethan inhaled slowly. This was getting out of control. He turned to Lena. "This isn't the place for this." Lena arched a brow. "No? Then what is the place, Ethan? Because I gave you 9 years to figure it out, and you never did." The words hit harder than they should have. Lucas looked up at Ethan, his expression unreadable. "So?" His voice wasn't angry now, just tired. "Are you going to pretend we don't exist, or are you going to act like a real father?" Ethan's breath hitched. Lucas wasn't asking if Ethan cared. He was asking if Ethan was going to walk away. Ethan wanted to move, wanted to say something, anything. But before he could, Lena exhaled, brushing a hand over Emma's hair as she turned to the boys. "We're done here," she said simply. And then, just like that, she walked away. Ethan stood frozen, watching as his children, his blood, followed her without hesitation. For the first time in his life, Ethan Cross was losing something he couldn't replace. Ethan Cross had faced countless high-stakes negotiations, billion-dollar acquisitions, and ruthless corporate betrayals, but nothing had ever shaken him like this. The grand hall that had once been the setting of his perfect wedding now felt like a crime scene, the wreckage of his carefully constructed life laid bare for the world to witness. The murmurs of guests lingered in the air like ghosts, the flashes of cameras from the press burning the moment into history. But none of it compared to the ache in his chest as he watched Lena walk away, their children beside her, their small hands gripping hers as if he had never existed. He should have said something. He should have stopped them. But he had stood there, silent, frozen in place, watching the only people who truly mattered disappear from his life. Sophia's voice cut through the thick air, laced with venom and barely contained fury. What the hell was that? Ethan turned to her, his jaw tightening. The fire in her green eyes was unmistakable. She had been humiliated, blindsided in front of every important person in their world. Sophia Monroe had spent years cultivating her image, curating every aspect of her life into a perfect, enviable brand. She had been a flawless choice for Ethan, a partnership built not on love, but on power. And now, that image was collapsing in real time. She took a step toward him, her manicured nails curled into fists. "You knew, didn't you?" she seethed. "You knew you had children, and you just didn't tell me." Ethan's eyes darkened. "I didn't know." Sophia laughed, a sharp, disbelieving sound. "You expect me to believe that? Ethan Cross, the man who controls everything, didn't know he had 3 children?" Something twisted inside him. Because she was right. How had he not known? How had he been so blind? Lena's words echoed in his mind. I didn't hide them from you, Ethan. You just never cared enough to look. His stomach churned. He had spent years building an empire, ensuring that every competitor, every deal, every move was under his control. He had eyes and ears everywhere, financial analysts who tracked stock trends before they even happened, a security team that could uncover a threat before it fully formed. And yet, he had missed the most important thing of all. Sophia took another breath, smoothing a hand over the silk of her gown in a practiced move of regaining composure. Then she lowered her voice to a deadly whisper. You've ruined us. Ethan's gaze snapped back to her. What? She gestured around them, her lips curling. This was supposed to be the wedding of the decade, Ethan. Our wedding. And now it's a scandal? She wasn't wrong. Already, he could see the way the narrative was shifting. Guests whispering in corners, some of them sneaking glances at their phones, reading the headlines before he even had a chance to control them. Billionaire Ethan Cross left at the altar as secret family emerges. Who is Lena Walker, and why did she keep Cross children from him? Sophia Monroe. Sophia Monroe humiliated. Is the power couple done for? His name was being rewritten. The legacy he had built was unraveling in real time. Sophia's lips parted, but before she could speak again, a new voice interrupted. Dante Reyes. Rough night, huh, Cross? Ethan clenched his jaw as Dante strolled toward them, the amusement in his dark eyes barely concealed. The bastard had been waiting for this. For years, Dante had once been his closest friend, back when they were both hungry, ambitious, clawing their way to the top. But things had changed. Power had shifted. And when Ethan won, Dante had been left behind. And he had never forgiven him for it. Dante adjusted the cuff of his custom suit, taking a slow sip of whiskey before flashing Ethan a smirk. I have to hand it to you. This is impressive. It's one thing to crash your own wedding, but to do it with 3 surprise children? That's a whole new level. Ethan exhaled sharply, his patience razor thin. Walk away, Dante. Dante chuckled. Come on, don't be like that. I'm just here to offer my condolences. His gaze flicked to Sophia, assessing her with practiced calculation. Though, I suppose I should congratulate you, Miss Monroe. You're officially the most talked-about woman in the world. Sophia's entire body stiffened, her knuckles whitening as she clenched the fabric of her gown. Dante thrived on power plays, and tonight, Ethan was bleeding out in the water. Ethan took a slow step forward, his voice dropping low. If you think this is an opportunity, Dante, you're mistaken. Dante's smirk didn't waver. Oh, I don't think. I know. A muscle in Ethan's jaw ticked, but he knew he couldn't afford to engage. Not now. Not here. Sophia, however, had reached her breaking point. She turned on her heel, her voice cold, clipped, and final. We're done. Ethan barely reacted. He had expected this. Sophia Monroe had spent years curating a perfect life, and Ethan Cross, the man with a secret family, did not fit into that narrative. She didn't wait for a response, didn't cause a scene. She simply lifted her chin, strode toward the exit, and walked out of his life. The moment the grand doors shut behind her, Ethan finally exhaled. Not in relief, not in regret, in realization. His life, his empire, had been built on the idea that control was everything, that as long as he held power, he could dictate every outcome. But tonight, he had lost the one thing he had never thought to fight for: his sons. Emma's small, trusting gaze flashed in his mind, the way Noah had studied him, silently measuring him up, the way Lucas had challenged him, unafraid, unimpressed. He had expected to intimidate them, to own the moment. Instead, they had left without hesitation. They hadn't needed him, because he had never been there to begin with. The thought settled in his chest like lead. A hand touched his arm. Andrea, his assistant, her expression cautious. "Do you need me to?" "No." Ethan cut her off, his voice quieter than usual. "Not now." Andrea hesitated, then nodded, stepping back. Ethan stood there, staring at the exit, the weight of the moment pressed against his ribs, suffocating. He had never allowed himself to dwell on regrets. But as he walked toward the exit, past the watching eyes, past the ruined remnants of what was supposed to be his greatest triumph, he knew one thing with absolute certainty. He was not letting them walk away again. Not this time. Not ever. Ethan Cross had spent years perfecting the art of control. Control over his company, control over his image, control over the empire he had built from nothing. But now, as he sat alone in his penthouse, the city stretching out beneath him in a sea of shimmering lights, he felt control slipping through his fingers. The wedding, the carefully orchestrated, flawless event, had collapsed into chaos. Sophia was gone. His public image was in free fall, and the headlines were already spreading like wildfire. Billionaire CEO's wedding ends in disaster as secret family is exposed. Ethan Cross, business mogul or deadbeat father. Sophia Monroe walks out amid paternity scandal. Ethan barely glanced at the articles. The scandal was inevitable. The fallout would come in waves. He could fix that. Money, PR, calculated damage control. But the one thing he couldn't fix, the one thing that mattered, was already gone. His sons. The image of them standing before him, eyes filled with unspoken judgment, had burned itself into his mind. Lucas, bald and unshaken, had challenged him outright. Noah, quieter but sharper, had studied him, searching for something he hadn't found. And Emma, small and trusting, had looked up at him like he was a stranger. And he was. His chest tightened as he ran a hand over his face, his mind spiraling back to the wedding, to Lena's voice. Steady, unwavering. "I didn't hide them from you, Ethan. You just never cared enough to look." She had cut him open with a single sentence. Ethan wanted to argue, wanted to tell himself that it wasn't true, that he hadn't abandoned them, that he hadn't known. But the deeper truth settled in his gut like a lead weight. Lena was right. If he had wanted to know, he would have. He had walked away from her without a second thought, never once wondering if there was more to the story, never once considering that she had been carrying something far more valuable than resentment when she left. He had missed their entire lives. Their first steps, their first words, every birthday, every scraped knee, every moment that mattered. And they hadn't needed him. That was the part that cut the deepest. His sons had never waited for him, never asked about him, because he had never been someone worth waiting for. The realization settled over him like a slow, suffocating weight. His phone vibrated against the glass table, the screen lighting up with endless missed calls. Investors, PR teams, Sophia's lawyers. None of them mattered. Ethan reached for his phone and scrolled past them all until he found the number he hadn't dialed in almost a decade. Lena Walker. He hesitated, just for a second. Then he pressed call. The phone rang once, twice, 3 times. Then, voicemail. You've reached Lena. Leave a message. A beep. Silence. Ethan exhaled slowly, gripping the phone tightly in his palm. He wasn't a man who left messages. He wasn't a man who waited for responses. But tonight, he wasn't the man he had always been. He forced himself to speak, his voice low, steady, but edged with something raw. Lena, I need to see them. A pause. Tell me where. Then he ended the call. And for the first time in his life, Ethan Cross had no idea what would happen next. The next morning, Ethan found himself outside a small neighborhood park, gripping the steering wheel so tightly his knuckles turned white. It wasn't his world. The sidewalks weren't polished, the buildings weren't glass fortresses. There were no chauffeurs, no high-end sports cars lining the street. This was her world, and now it was theirs. Through the windshield, he spotted them immediately. Lena sat on a weathered wooden bench, her posture relaxed but watchful. And then, his children. Lucas was climbing a jungle gym, pushing himself higher, testing his limits without fear. Noah was kicking a soccer ball against an empty goal, precise, focused. And Emma sat on the grass with a sketchbook in her lap, her tiny hands moving in careful strokes. Ethan exhaled. He had closed billion-dollar deals without hesitation, had built an empire without ever questioning his decisions. And yet, stepping out of this car felt impossible. Because this wasn't business. This was something he couldn't buy, couldn't negotiate. This was everything he had lost. And if he walked away now, he would lose them forever. Ethan pushed open the car door. The sound wasn't loud, but it was enough. Lena looked up first. Their eyes met. She didn't move, didn't react. She was waiting. Not for an apology, not for excuses. She was waiting to see if he would actually follow through. Ethan took a slow, deliberate step forward. Then another, and another. By the time he reached the edge of the playground, Lucas had noticed him. The boy froze at the top of the jungle gym, his hands gripping the bars. His brown eyes, Ethan's eyes, narrowed. He didn't say anything, didn't move. He just stared. Then Noah saw him. His soccer ball rolled to a stop as he hesitated, glancing at Lena, as if waiting for some kind of signal. And finally, Emma. Her pencil paused against the page, her small face tilting as she studied him. Ethan's breath was shallow, his chest tight. He had expected recognition, had expected anger. Instead, what he saw in their faces was something far worse. Indifference. Not hatred, not longing. Just nothing. Because to them, he wasn't a father. He was a stranger, and he had no one to blame but himself. Lena finally spoke. Her voice was even, unreadable. "Boys," she said, her tone light, "this is Ethan Cross. Not your father. Not Dad. Just his name. A title. Nothing more." Lucas climbed down from the jungle gym, dusting off his hands. His gaze never wavered. "You're the guy from the wedding," he said flatly. Ethan nodded. "I am." Noah's brows furrowed. "Why are you here?" Ethan inhaled. There were 100 ways to answer that question, 100 ways to spin the narrative. But for once in his life, he didn't want to spin anything. He wanted to be honest. "Because I should have been here sooner," he admitted. Silence. Then Lucas crossed his arms, his jaw set. "So why weren't you?" It was a simple question. And yet, it carried more weight than anything Ethan had ever faced. He had spent his life dodging accountability, spinning his mistakes into strategic advantages. But there was no sidestepping this. "I didn't know about you," he said, his voice quieter than he intended. "If I had—" Lucas cut him off. "People find out things when they want to." Ethan stilled. Because Lucas was right. He could have looked for Lena. He could have checked in. He hadn't. And now it was his turn to prove himself. Ethan Cross had always been a man who commanded respect the moment he stepped into a room. His presence alone could silence board meetings. His name carried weight in every financial sector, and his reputation was enough to make competitors think twice before challenging him. But standing here in this ordinary park, surrounded by the quiet hum of a world that had never needed him, he felt small. Lucas was still watching him, arms crossed, the stubborn defiance in his stance so eerily familiar that Ethan could almost see himself reflected in it. Noah's sharp gaze flickered between him and Lena, like he was analyzing a puzzle and trying to decide if it was worth solving. And Emma, sweet Emma, simply stared at him, her expression unreadable in a way that sent an unfamiliar ache through his chest. Ethan had been prepared for rejection. He had anticipated anger, accusations, maybe even outright hostility. What he hadn't been prepared for was this. This empty space between him and them, filled with years he had missed, with moments he could never get back. Lena remained quiet, her face unreadable. She wasn't going to intervene. She was letting them decide for themselves. Lucas spoke first, breaking the silence like a hammer striking glass. "So what, you show up now and think that fixes everything?" Ethan didn't flinch. He met his son's gaze head-on, his voice steady. "No," he said simply, "I don't." Lucas's jaw tightened, like he had expected a different answer, an excuse, a justification. Ethan gave him none. Noah shifted his weight, kicking his soccer ball idly. "So, why are you here?" Ethan exhaled. The answer to that was complicated. But the truth? That was simple. "Because I should have been here sooner," he said. The wind rustled through the trees, the sounds of other children playing in the distance, a stark contrast to the tension hanging between them. Lucas narrowed his eyes. "You didn't answer my brother's question." Ethan glanced at Noah, whose gaze had sharpened, waiting. Why now? Why had he waited until his entire life had imploded before coming for them? Ethan didn't have a good answer. "I didn't know about you," he admitted, the words feeling heavier than he expected. "If I had—" Lucas scoffed. "You would have, sent us a check?" Ethan's jaw tightened, but he didn't let the frustration show. "No," he said evenly. "I would have been here." Lucas gave him a long, measured look. "That's convenient." Ethan almost smirked. The kid had his fire. Noah wasn't as confrontational, but he wasn't backing down either. His voice was quieter, but just as sharp. "You could have looked for Mom." Ethan hesitated for a fraction of a second. A second too long. Lucas caught it. "That's what I thought." A sharp pang of regret cut through him. Because they were right. He could have looked. He should have. And no matter how much he wanted to rewrite history, he hadn't. Lena finally spoke, her voice soft but firm. "Come sit down, Ethan." It wasn't an invitation. It was a test. She was watching him closely, waiting to see if he would actually step into their world, or if this was just another power move. Ethan walked over to the bench and sat, not next to her, not too close. The boys didn't move, but Emma did. She climbed onto the bench beside Lena, swinging her legs slightly, her small hands resting on her lap. Ethan's eyes flickered to her. She was the only one who hadn't spoken. The only one who hadn't judged him yet. "Hi, Emma," he said carefully. She blinked at him. "Hi." That was it. Nothing more. No warmth, no anger. Just curiosity. Ethan exhaled. It was a start. Noah was still watching him. What now? Ethan didn't have a perfect answer. "I don't know," he admitted. "But I want to be in your lives. If you'll let me." Lucas snorted. "That's not how this works." Ethan met his gaze. "Then tell me how it works." Lucas hesitated, because he didn't know either. Lena studied Ethan, her expression unreadable. "It's not up to me," she said simply. "It's up to them." Ethan turned back to his sons. "Then tell me what you need from me." Noah tilted his head, considering. "You're a billionaire." Ethan's lips twitched. "That's not a secret." Noah narrowed his eyes. "We don't need your money." Ethan nodded. "I know." Lucas scoffed. "Do you?" Ethan's expression didn't change. "Yeah, because if it had just been about money, Lena never would have walked away." Lucas crossed his arms. "You want to prove yourself? Then show up." Ethan met his gaze, steady. "I will." Lucas squinted. "We'll see." It wasn't trust, not yet. But it wasn't rejection either. And for now, that was enough. Lena rose from the bench, brushing her hands over the fabric of her jeans. "This doesn't mean anything, Ethan," she said, her voice softer now, but no less firm. "One conversation doesn't erase the past." Ethan stood, his gaze locked onto hers. "I don't expect it to." Lena nodded, turning to the boys. "Let's go." Lucas and Noah didn't hesitate. They started walking, but Emma lagged behind for a moment. She looked up at Ethan, her big brown eyes filled with something different, something softer. Then, without a word, she reached into her sketchbook, tore out a page, and handed it to him. Ethan took it carefully. It was a drawing of him. Not in a suit, not in a skyscraper, just standing there with them. Something in his chest tightened. Emma gave him one last look. Then she turned and ran after her brothers. Ethan watched them go. And for the first time in his life, he realized winning wasn't the point anymore. Not in this. This wasn't about strategy. This was about earning something he had never even known he wanted. His family. And he wasn't going to let them slip away again. Ethan Cross was not a man accustomed to uncertainty. In business, he made decisions quickly and decisively. In life, he shaped reality to fit his will. There was no hesitation, no second-guessing. And yet, for the first time in years, he didn't know what the hell he was doing. The days that followed his meeting with his children were unlike any he had experienced before. Normally, his morning started with urgent emails and market updates, his days filled with high-stakes meetings and calculated negotiations. Now, his mornings started with hesitation, with his phone in his hand, staring at Lena's number, wondering if today was the day he'd overstep. Because for the first time, he wasn't in control. His sons didn't trust him. Lucas was openly skeptical, challenging him at every turn. waiting for him to prove that this wasn't just a temporary distraction. Noah was more reserved, but Ethan could see the gears turning behind his eyes, assessing every move Ethan made. And Emma? Sweet, innocent Emma? Was the only one who hadn't decided whether he was worth keeping yet. Ethan could fix a corporate crisis in 24 hours, but winning over his children? That was going to take more than a press release and a well-placed donation. So, he did something he had never done before. He showed up. Not just once, not just when it was convenient. He showed up every single day. At first, Lena didn't say much when he arrived. She simply watched. The boys tested him. Lucas would throw out impossible challenges just to see if Ethan would back down. Race me to the end of the street. No excuses. Bet you can't climb that tree faster than me. You ever even touch a basketball before? Or just million-dollar contracts? Ethan didn't back down. Noah, on the other hand, wasn't interested in challenges. He was interested in consistency. He didn't push Ethan away, but he didn't invite him in either. He simply waited to see if Ethan would keep coming back. And then there was Emma. She didn't test him the way her brothers did. She simply watched, studying him the way a child studies the ocean, curious, fascinated, but wary of stepping in too deep. Ethan had expected them to resist, to reject him outright. What he hadn't expected was how much he wanted to be there. For the first time in his life, his schedule wasn't dictated by shareholders or board meetings. It was dictated by school pickups, soccer practices, and impromptu races down the sidewalk. And somehow, despite everything, he found himself liking it. Until the night everything shifted. It started with a phone call. Ethan was in his penthouse, staring out over the city, debating whether or not to call Lena and ask if he could take the boys out for dinner. Then his phone rang. "Lena?" He answered immediately. "Lena?" She sounded out of breath. "I need a favor." Ethan straightened. "What's wrong?" "I got called into work. It's last minute and I can't find a sitter. I wouldn't ask if it wasn't an emergency." He didn't even hesitate. "I'll be there in 10. Lena went silent for a moment. "Okay." Then the line went dead. Ethan hadn't expected this. Lena never asked him for anything. She was fiercely independent, refusing to rely on anyone, especially him. Which meant this was more than just a favor. This was a test. And Ethan wasn't going to fail. The moment he stepped into Lena's house, he realized just how unprepared he was. The boys were already halfway through dinner when he arrived, their plates filled with something homemade and steaming. Lucas barely looked up from his food. "Took you long enough." Ethan smirked. Traffic. Noah was more observant. He watched Ethan closely as he stepped further into the house, as if still trying to figure out what to do with him. "And Emma?" Emma beamed when she saw him. "Ethan's here," she announced to no one in particular, swinging her legs under the table. Something in Ethan's chest loosened. Lena appeared in the doorway, already grabbing her coat. "I won't be gone long," she said, her tone even, unreadable. "They've already eaten. Emma's bedtime is at 8. The boys can stay up a little later." Ethan nodded, standing a little straighter. "I got it." Lena gave him one last look, then, to his surprise, she nodded. And then she was gone. And Ethan? Ethan was alone, with 3 children, for the first time in his entire life. He exhaled slowly, rolling his shoulders back. He'd closed billion-dollar deals under worse pressure. How hard could this be? An hour later, he was sweating. Lucas had immediately dragged him outside for a game of basketball, determined to destroy him. Noah had been less aggressive but no less competitive, spending 20 minutes trying to land a perfect trick shot into the hoop before finally getting it. And Emma? Emma had curled up next to him on the porch, sketchbook in hand, completely content. It was chaotic. It was exhausting. And Ethan wouldn't have traded it for anything. By the time Lena came home, the boys were sprawled out on the couch, Emma fast asleep against Ethan's side. Lena paused in the doorway, her gaze sweeping over the scene. Ethan, his arm resting protectively around Emma, his tie loosened, his expression softer than she had ever seen it. He looked different. For a long moment, she just watched. Then she exhaled, crossing her arms. "They didn't chase you out, huh?" Ethan smirked, carefully shifting Emma so she could rest against a pillow. "Not yet." Lena shook her head, a small, almost imperceptible smile flickering across her lips. Ethan caught it, and for the first time since this entire mess started, he felt like he had taken a real step forward. The road ahead wasn't going to be easy. He still had a long way to go. But sitting here, surrounded by his children, with Lena watching him not like a mistake, but like a possibility, Ethan knew one thing for certain. He wasn't going anywhere. Ethan Cross had always believed in control. He had spent years mastering it, shaping his world to fit his vision, ensuring that every move he made was calculated and deliberate. But now, as he sat on the sidelines of a middle school soccer field, watching his son sprint across the grass with sharp precision, he realized something. He didn't want to control this. He just wanted to be here. Jaden weaved through defenders with a confidence that reminded Ethan of himself, his focus unshaken. He took the shot, a clean, powerful strike that sent the ball flying into the net. The crowd erupted in cheers. Ethan, before he could stop himself, was on his feet, clapping, letting out a sharp, approving, "That's my boy." Jaden glanced at him. Their eyes met. For a second, just a second, there was recognition. A flicker of something that hadn't been there before. Ethan's chest tightened. And then, just as quickly, Jaden turned back to his teammates, joining them in their celebration. Not rejection, not acceptance. Just acknowledgement. And for now, that was enough. Later that evening, Ethan stood in Lena's kitchen, leaning against the counter as she rinsed a few dishes in the sink. The kids were in the living room, their laughter drifting softly through the house. It was strange, being here like this. Casual, comfortable. Lena hadn't asked him to stay for dinner, but she hadn't asked him to leave either. And that meant something. "You didn't have to come to his game, you know," Lena said, her voice neutral. Ethan tilted his head, studying her. "You'd think I would have missed it?" She sighed, shutting off the water, turning to face him. "Old you?" "Absolutely." Ethan exhaled, rubbing a hand over his jaw. "Yeah. Probably." Lena crossed her arms. "And now?" "Now." He hesitated, choosing his words carefully. "Now, I don't want to miss anything." Lena watched him for a long moment. Ethan held her gaze, and then she did something unexpected. She smiled. Not much, barely there, but real. Ethan's stomach twisted in a way that had nothing to do with regret. It had to do with something much more dangerous. Hope. The next morning, Ethan made the biggest decision of his life. He was standing in his office, his empire sprawling beneath him through the floor-to-ceiling windows. The city had always been his kingdom. the power, the wealth, the influence. This was his legacy. But now, as he stared at the blinking red light of his phone, messages from investors, from PR teams, from people desperate to clean up his image, he felt nothing, because his real legacy wasn't here. It was sitting in a small house across town, eating breakfast, getting ready for school. It was a stubborn, fearless boy who challenged him every chance he got. It was a quiet, observant son who measured him with careful eyes. It was a little girl who still hadn't decided if he belonged in her world yet. And it was the woman who had raised them, without him, who had carried all of the weight while he had built an empire that suddenly didn't seem as important as it once did. Ethan pressed a button on his desk. Andrea's voice crackled through the speaker. "Yes, Mr. Cross?" "Call a board meeting," he said, effective immediately. There was a pause. Then, carefully, she asked, "For what purpose?" Ethan looked out over the city one last time. To step back. The room was silent when he made the announcement. Half the boardroom stared at him like he had lost his mind. "You're stepping down?" one of them repeated. Ethan nodded. "Not entirely. I'm still the majority shareholder, but I'm not running the company day to day anymore." His CFO, an older man who had been with Crosstech since the beginning, folded his hands. "Ethan, let's not be rash." "This isn't rash," Ethan interrupted smoothly. "I've given years to this company, built it from the ground up. I think I've earned the right to prioritize something else for a change." A murmur spread across the table. Dante Reyes, his biggest rival, leaned back in his chair, smirking. "And what, exactly, is more important than Crosstech?" Ethan didn't hesitate. "My kids." Silence. Dante's smirk faltered. Ethan stood, buttoning his jacket. "I'd trust the board to handle things in my absence," he said, his voice calm, final. "This isn't a negotiation." And with that, he walked out of the boardroom. For the first time in his life, he didn't look back. That evening, Ethan stood in front of Lena's house, the weight of the day pressing against his shoulders. He had spent years believing that success meant power. Now he realized success meant showing up. He knocked. Lena opened the door, eyebrows lifting slightly. "This is unexpected." Ethan inhaled. "I put my company in the hands of my board today." Lena blinked. "You what?" "I'm stepping back." He shoved his hands into his pockets, his voice softer now. "I don't need to be in every meeting. I don't need to control every move the company makes." Lena studied him carefully. "Why?" Ethan let out a slow breath. "Because I spent my whole life chasing something I thought mattered." He met her gaze. "And then you walked into that wedding with them, and I realized how much I had already lost." Lena's lips parted slightly, but she didn't speak. So Ethan kept going. "I missed their whole lives," he said, his voice quieter now. "I missed their first steps, their first words, birthdays, school events. I missed everything." Lena swallowed. Ethan took a step closer. "I can't change the past, Lena, but I can be here now, if you let me." For the first time, Lena looked shaken. Not angry, not guarded, just uncertain. "You don't get to just decide that," she whispered. "You don't get to show up and expect everything to fall into place." "I know," Ethan said. "That's why I'm not asking you to believe me. I'm just asking you to let me prove it." The silence stretched between them. Then, slowly, Lena nodded. You have a lot to prove, she murmured. Ethan's lips quirked into the faintest smile. I know. And he would. Because this time, he wasn't chasing a deal. He was chasing something real. And he wasn't going to let it slip away. Thank you for staying with us until the very end of this story. We appreciate every moment you've spent here, immersing yourself in Ethan's journey of redemption, love, and the pursuit of something far more valuable than success: family. This story teaches us a powerful lesson. No amount of wealth, power, or prestige can replace the time lost with the people who truly matter. Ambition may build an empire, but it cannot rebuild broken bonds. True success isn't measured by money. It's measured by the relationships we nurture, the moments we choose to be present for, and the courage to admit when we were wrong. Ethan's story reminds us that it's never too late to change. It's never too late to step up, to take responsibility, and to fight for the people we love. The past cannot be rewritten, but the future is always ours to shape. Where are you watching from? We'd love to hear from you in the comments. And if you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more powerful narratives that inspire, move, and challenge us to be better. See you in the next one.